Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel and I thank you for taking your interest in this topic. In this video, I'm going to share with you the important points that you need to know about national parks and wildlife sanctuary, such as the different activities permitted and prohibited inside the national park or in the wildlife sanctuaries, who are the official in charge of national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, and the major differences between national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, and lastly, in brief, what are community reserve and what are conservation reserves. So to begin with, what are national parks and wildlife sanctuaries? National parks or wildlife sanctuaries are the designated protected areas whose main objectives or purposes is to protect, preserve, and conserve the wild animals and their natural habitat from any human interferences. As per the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, protected areas are categorized into four different types, and they are wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, conservation reserves, and the community reserve. To declare any area as a wildlife sanctuary or a national park, any area within the state, be it the land area or the territorial water, such area should fulfill the following criteria. That is, the land area or the territorial water area should have rich biodiversity of flora and fauna. The geomorphology or the landscape or the topography of the area should be distinctive, and the ecosystem of the area should be of great ecological importance. And finally, the area national habitat and the wildlife present should be diverse and of great importance to the state and the country as a whole. So, when any area fulfills this mentioned criteria, then the state government will declare such areas as protected areas. And the purpose of such declaration is to protect, to conserve, to propagate, and to preserve wild animals and their natural habitat or its natural environment. Next, once the area have fulfilled the required criteria and are decided to be notified and declared as national park or wildlife sanctuary, then the state government will appoint officer in charge or authorized person to the notified or declared national park and wildlife sanctuary. The state government will first appoint the collector, the officer who will be taking care of the administration work before the area is been declared as national park and wildlife sanctuary. Then later, after the protected area has been declared as national park or wildlife sanctuary, the state government will appoint the chief wildlife warden, who is the authorized persons in charge of taking care and managing the national park and the wildlife sanctuary. Therefore, these are the two main officials in charge appointed by the state government. One is before the area is officially declared, that is the collector, and the other is after the area has been officially declared as national park or wildlife sanctuary, and the person in charge is the chief wildlife warden. Now let's see what are the different responsibilities of the collector who is in charge before the area is been declared as a national park or a wildlife sanctuaries. His responsibilities are to inquire and find out if any person residing in the vicinity of the area proposed to be declared as national park or wildlife sanctuaries has any rights over the land or not. If yes, the collector will validate the nature and the extent of the right. The next question is, how will the collector perform this humongous task? He cannot go knocking doors, right? So the answer is, he will make an official announcement by advertising in the local language newspaper that any person who has any rights or claim to have rights over the land shall, within a period of 60 days from the date of the advertisement, shall make their claim by filling up the prescribed form in which they will specify the nature and the extent of their rights over the land, by providing all the details and documents necessary. Then, if the claim made by the person is valid, then the responsibility of the collector on behalf of the state government is to come to an agreement with this person who has some right over the land. The agreement is the, the state government will compensate the person by paying him some amount of money or by giving some plot of land somewhere else. And the person rights will then be transferred to the state government. This responsibility of the collector should be completed within 2 years from the date of notification of declaration of the national park or the wildlife sanctuaries. With this, next we will see what are the different power of the collector. The power of the collector is he has the right to enter the land, the proposed protected area. He has the right to survey, to demarcate and make a map of the area. He has the right to either accept or reject the claim made by any person. He also has the right to exclude such claims made by any person from the limit of the proposed sanctuary. Now, once the area has been declared as a national park or a wildlife sanctuary, the person who is authorized by the state government to control, manage, and maintain the national park or the wildlife sanctuaries is the chief wildlife warden. The authorities given to the chief wildlife warden are he may construct road, bridges, buildings, fences, or barrier gates inside the protected area. However, these constructions are not for commercial purposes. If he thinks or deems fit, he may also take necessary measures to improve the habitat of the protected area. The chief wildlife warden can regulate, control, or even prohibit the grazing or movement of livestock into the protected area. The chief wildlife warden shall also take measures for immunization of livestock which are kept within 5 km radius from the protected area. Once the area has been declared as national park and wildlife sanctuaries, first let us see what are the different activities that are permitted inside. Any person who wants to document and study the plants and animals present in the protected area or carry out scientific research study on the plant or the wild animals on the ecosystem inside the protected area or undertaking wildlife or plant photography tourism are allowed to enter the national park or the wildlife sanctuaries, but only after they are granted permission by the chief wildlife warden. Next, let's see what are the different activities that are prohibited inside the national park and the wildlife sanctuaries. Inside the national and the wildlife sanctuaries, no person are allowed to destroy or remove or poach or kill any wildlife, including the forest produce. No person is allowed to destroy or damage or divert the habitat of any wild animals. No person is allowed to divert, to stop, or even enhance the flow of water into or outside the protected area. No person is allowed to set fire or leave any fire burning in such a manner as to endanger the protected area. And also, no person is allowed to enter the protected areas with weapon. No person is allowed to use any chemicals or explosive or any substances which might cause injury or endanger to the wildlife which is present within the protected area. No person is allowed to tease or even molest any wild animals. No person is allowed to enter and litter the protected area. And no person is allowed to enter and have an intention to damage the boundary of the protected area. These are the activities which are strictly prohibited inside the national park or a wildlife sanctuary. Now, what are the different roles of any person residing near or within the protected area? Any person who resides near or within the protected area shall not go against the Wildlife Protection Act. The person should help in identifying and arresting the offenders. The person will also help in reporting the death of any wild animal and safeguard its remain to the authority concerned. And the person also will assist in extinguishing of any fire and also prevent it from spreading. A person will also assist this government officials such as the forest officer, chief wildlife warden, or the police officer that require his or her aid. Any person possessing arms and residing in or within 10 kilometers radius of any such protected area should register himself within 3 months from the declaration of any area as a sanctuary or a national park. And a person is allowed to collect forest produce from in and out around the national park or the wildlife sanctuaries only to meet his personal needs, but not for him to use it for commercial purposes. Next, we will see the difference between a wildlife sanctuary and a national park. Sanctuary, the limit of the area is specified but not defined. But in case of national park, the limit of the area is defined, or in other words, the boundary is defined. In sanctuary, grazing of livestock is permitted, but only after getting immunized. Whereas in national park, no grazing of any livestock is permitted. In sanctuary, the control and regulated movement of livestock is permitted, whereas in national park, no livestock shall be allowed to enter inside except when such livestock is used as a vehicle by a person authorized. Next, in sanctuary, there are certain rights which are permitted within the limit of the sanctuary, such as the entry of a person who has any rights over any immovable property, whereas human has no right over property within the national park. Sanctuary falls under the category 4 of the IUCN Protected Area Classification, whereas national parks falls under the category 2 of the IUCN Protected Area Classification. Status of the sanctuary is lower when compared to the national park, whereas status of the national park is higher compared to that of the sanctuary. And a sanctuary can be upgraded to the national park, whereas you cannot downgrade a national park into a sanctuary. Next, there are 551 wildlife sanctuaries in India, whereas there are 104 existing national parks in India. And such area cover about 3.64% of the total geographical area of the country, and whereas national park cover about 1.23% of the India geographical area. Under the Wildlife Protection Act, Chapter 4 is divided into 4 chapters. Chapter 4, Chapter 4A, 4B, and Chapter 4C. And Chapter 4 specifically deals with the protected area. And these protected area range from the section 18 up to section 38. Section 18 up to section 34 talks about sanctuary. Section 35 talks about the national parks. Section 36A and 36B talks about the conservation reserve. Section 36C and Section 36D talks about the community reserve, whereas the Section 38 of the protected area talks about the sanctuaries or national park which is declared by central government. So with this, we'll come to the last part, which is what do you mean by a conservation reserve? Conservation reserve. The state government, in consultation with the local community, will identify and declare any area which is adjacent to the national park or the sanctuaries, or the area which link or connect one protected area with another as conservation reserve. A community reserve is an area which is not included in any national park or a sanctuary or a conservation reserve. Actually, this area belongs to an individual or a community, but these individuals or community volunteer their lands to be declared as a protected area. The state government will declare this area as a protected area and are known as the community reserve. So these are just a few examples of the wildlife sanctuaries in India, and these are a few examples of the national parks in India. And these are the references that I use for this presentation in this video. So with this, we have come to an end of this video. So thank you so much for watching. and I believe and I hope this video will be of great help to you. Thank you so much once again, and God blessed.